Hello everyone, Professor Kruzluk here. I wanted to make a video talking about the recent updates with the Russia-Ukraine war and what they mean for US national security. So, it's been a little while since I made a video talking about recent updates with the Russia-Ukraine war, but I thought it was appropriate to make one talking about what's going on with the war between Russia and Ukraine, where it stands, focusing on the most recent developments, and just as importantly, what those developments mean for American national security. So there has been a lot of discussion recently about diplomacy. You've probably seen pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky, the Russian president, at Mar-a-Lago in Florida meeting Donald Trump. You may have seen articles talking about discussing the phone conversation between Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, and Donald Trump. So we're hearing and seeing articles about possible peace frameworks. Trump is saying that we're actually kind of close to a peace deal. We've had these renewal talks. So it's getting some media attention about, hey, there might be an end to the conflict down the road. So at the same time, there's also been a clear increase in military activity, appearingly some escalation. You may have seen articles about the Russians are saying the Ukrainians deliberately targeted a house that Vladimir Putin can stay in. So the Russians are saying this is an escalation. So you may have seen those articles. These two things of negotiations and military escalation they might seem contradictory, but in practice, they oftentimes go together. In many conflicts, moments of diplomatic engagement and diplomacy are indeed paired with intensified fighting as each side tries to strengthen its position before negotiations move forward. So understanding that dynamic is really essential for making sense of where the war is right now. So as we know, over the past several weeks, Russia has carried out some of its largest and most sustained aerial attacks in months, relying heavily on drones and long-range missiles. These strikes have targeted major Ukrainian cities, lots of targets against energy infrastructure, something we've seen over the past 3 years, trying to knock out Ukrainian infrastructure, trying to make winter miserable in Ukraine. We've seen transportation hubs attacked, civilian areas. I'm sure you've seen videos of civilian areas, apartment bombings being attacked, including in the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. So the timing of these attacks does matter. They have taken place, although we've seen a sustained effort over the past 3 years, we have seen some intensifying attacks over the past recent history. They have taken place during winter conditions when damage to electricity, heating, and water systems has a much greater impact on civilian life, daily life across Ukraine. When power goes out in freezing temperatures, the consequences are not just these abstract ideas about targeting infrastructure, but hospitals struggle to function, homes become unsafe, and daily life becomes significantly harder across Ukraine. So from a military perspective, these strikes force Ukrainians to allocate scarce resources to air defense, infrastructure repair, rather than frontline operations. From a political perspective, they're designed to test Ukrainian morale, Ukrainian endurance. And from a strategic perspective, they send a message both to Kyiv and its supporters that Russia retains the ability to impose costs even after years of war. So this is a familiar strategy. Rather than seeking a single decisive blow, Russia is applying persistent pressure aiming to exhaust Ukraine over time. On the battlefield itself, Russian forces have continued to make slow, incremental gains in parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. These advances are measured in villages and small territorial shifts rather than sweeping offensives or major key cities in the east of Ukraine. That distinction is rather important because this is not a war of rapid maneuver where Russia is sweeping across eastern Ukraine. It has, as we've heard over the past several years, it's turning into a war of attrition. In wars of attrition, success is defined less by speed and more by endurance. Who can replace troops? Who can maintain industrial output, military output, who can sustain public support, and who can outlast the other politically and economically. Russia appears willing, or at least Vladimir Putin appears willing to accept extremely high costs to continue applying pressure to Ukraine. Ukrainian forces, for their part, have demonstrated remarkable resistance and resilience. But that resilience depends heavily on continued external support, particularly from the United States and European allies. That means the war is not only being fought in Ukraine, but also diplomatic discussions in Western capitals, where debates over funding, weapons production and allocation, and long term commitments continue to shape the battlefield indirectly. One of the most concerning recent developments has been Russia's decision to deploy nuclear capable systems into Belarus. A couple newspaper articles that came out here at the end of 2025, the Russian authorities are putting up pictures of these nuclear capable missile systems, arguing they've arrived in Belarus. This move has drawn attention not because it suggests an imminent nuclear strike, but because of what it represents strategically. This is a classic example of nuclear signaling. By positioning these systems closer to NATO territory, Russia is reminding the United States and its allies that this conflict exists under the shadow of nuclear escalation. It introduces uncertainty into Western decision making and raises the stakes of every policy choice related to Ukraine. As a side note, there's a Bernstein book, War, where Bernstein lays out some of these decision making. Some of these decisions and how they were being made during the Biden administration because of a concern about nuclear escalation. Well, here over the past week, over the past several days, we've seen this discussion really come to the forefront because now Russia has moved these nuclear capabilities into Belarus closer as this escalatory rhetoric. So it is important to be clear here, though. There is no credible evidence that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. However, nuclear weapons do not need to be used to influence behavior. Just like if you read the internal workings of the Biden administration, the idea that nuclear weapons could be used shaped how the Biden team was responding to the initial invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So today, their mere presence can really continue to shape strategic calculations. For U.S. policymakers, this creates the constant balancing act. How to provide enough support to help Ukraine defend itself without crossing thresholds that could provoke a wider and far more dangerous confrontation with Russia. That tension has been really present since the earliest days of the war, like I said, and it remains one of the central constraints to American policy, American foreign policy, American policy of helping Ukraine. So, alongside the military escalation, Russia has continued to wage information and narrative warfare. One recent example was Moscow's claim that Ukraine attempted a drone attack on Vladimir Putin's residency, as I said at the outset. This has really been all over the news. If you follow the conflict day to day, you've probably encountered quite a few articles of how Russia is responding to this perceived attack. Ukraine, for their part, has denied the claims, and independent verification has been lacking. But whether or not an incident occurred, the function of the claim itself matters. These narratives serve multiple purposes. They can be used to justify further escalation, to portray Ukraine as reckless or dangerous, or to undermine diplomatic initiatives by suggesting that Kiev is a bad faith actor. Information warfare is not a sideshow in this conflict. It is a central component of how the war is fought. So Russia has consistently and constantly used these tactics to shape domestic opinion and influence how international audiences interpret events on the ground in Ukraine. So another critical dimension of the conflict is the economic front, particularly Russia's continued targeting of Ukraine's ports, Ukrainian infrastructure. Ukrainian economy, we know, relies heavily on agriculture exports, especially grain. These exports are not only vital to Ukraine's own revenue, but also for global food markets. When Ukrainian ports are disrupted, grain shipments slow, grain shipments might stop, prices rise, and food insecurity worsens in vulnerable regions around the world. This means that the war has direct consequences far beyond Eastern Europe. Disruptions to global food supplies can contribute to political instability in parts of Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. From this perspective of the United States, this connects the war in Ukraine to a broader concerns about global stability, humanitarian crises, economic security, and refugee crises. So, in modern national security thinking, these issues are deeply interconnected. Economic shocks and food shortages can destabilize governments, fuel conflict, and create new security challenges that ultimately affect U.S. national security interests. So at the same time that the military and economic pressures are intensifying, diplomatic engagement has increased. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has held discussions with U.S. leaders, and Washington has taken an active role in exploring possible diplomatic frameworks over the past several weeks. Again, you've probably seen pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky in Florida, in Mar-a-Lago, meeting President Trump. This has led to a natural question: if the talks are happening, why is fighting getting worse? The answer is that diplomacy and violence oftentimes move in parallel. Talking does not mean agreeing, and negotiations rarely begin with trust. Instead, they begin with attempts to gain leverage on other parties. So right now, there are deep disagreements over fundamental issues: territory, security guarantees, and Ukraine's future alignment. Is it closer to NATO? Is it closer to the European Union? Is there some security guarantee from NATO or from the United States? So from Ukraine's perspective, any agreement that leaves it vulnerable to renewed Russian aggression is unacceptable. From Russia's perspective, any outcome that leaves Ukraine firmly anchored in the Western security architecture represents a strategic failure and is probably unacceptable. These positions seem and are extremely far apart, and this is why diplomacy remains quite fragile, even if Donald Trump comes out and says we are close to an agreement, because that agreement still has huge hurdles to get over. So all of this brings us to a central question. Why does this war matter for U.S. national security? For the United States, the war in Ukraine is not only about defending one country's sovereignty, it is about the credibility of U.S. commitments, the stability of the European security order, and the future of deterrence in a world increasingly defined by competition among major powers. One of the key concerns in Washington is precedent. If Russia is seen as successfully changing borders through force, it sends a signal to other states that might consider similar actions. That signal does not stop at Europe. We've heard a lot, we've read about what signal does this send to China? Is it okay to have a military confrontation with Taiwan? How the U.S. and European allies respond to this conflict matters beyond just the borders of Ukraine. So U.S. policymakers are acutely aware that decisions made in Ukraine will be watched closely elsewhere, including in Beijing, including regions where American security commitments are also under scrutiny. So this strategic context helps explain recent shifts in U.S. policy language. In its most recent national security strategy, the United States has placed greater emphasis on stabilization, risk management, and burden sharing with allies. This does not represent necessarily a retreat from supporting Ukraine. Rather, the Trump administration argues that it reflects an attempt to balance competing priorities in an increasingly complex global environment. The United States must consider its commitments in Europe alongside challenges in other regions, including the Indo-Pacific. In practical terms, this means Washington is focused not only on helping Ukraine defend itself, but also on preventing the war from expanding or escalating in ways that could draw the United States into direct conflict. So, one of the most debated issues within this framework is the question of long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. Supporters of stronger guarantees argue that they would deter future aggression and provide Ukraine with the confidence needed to rebuild the country. Critics counter that binding commitments could entangle the United States into a direct military confrontation with Russia down the road. This debate highlights a fundamental dilemma in U.S. national security policy: how to deter aggression without creating automatic pathways to escalation. There is no risk-free option here, only trade-offs. So, Russia's actions have also placed renewed strain on NATO. The war has reinforced the importance of collective defense, but it has also exposed differences among allies in terms of threat perceptions, defense spending, and politically willingness to accept risk. The United States remains the central pillar of the alliance. How it navigates this moment will shape NATO's cohesion and credibility for years to come. So stepping back, it is clear that the Russia-Ukraine war has evolved into something far larger than just a regional conflict. It is a prolonged test of endurance, a struggle over norms and sovereignty, and providing a proven ground for modern deterrence and modern weaponry. We've seen many articles about the use of drones, the expansion of drones, how drone warfare is changing warfare going forward. For the United States, the challenge the challenge is not simply how to support Ukraine today, but how to ensure that the way this war ends does not make the international system more unstable tomorrow. Okay, thank you for watching.